guys, welcome to the Just Pearly Things YouTube channel and welcome to the Sit Down. Today I have a special guest, Janice Fiamengo. She is a professor, a former professor of English at the University of Ottawa, Canada, an avid follower of the anti-feminist movement, free speech advocate, and defender of men's rights. And you started your career in 2009 as a professor at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks very much for having me on your show.
So, tell me what got you into like anti-feminist? Anti-feminist.
Yeah.
Like, have you always been an anti-feminist, or like what started this?
Yeah, this could take up the whole time, so I'll try not to be too long-winded. I was actually a feminist. Even I would say I was a radical feminist. I went to university. I did all my degrees at the University of British Columbia. And from the time I was quite young, I really wanted to be an English professor. I wanted to teach literature. And so I did my undergraduate degree. I think it was pretty non-political. I don't remember, like I started university in 1982. So the universities were already then becoming politicized, but not to the extent that they have been now. But all of the social justice theories, Marxist theory, critical race theory, feminist theory, eco-criticism, all of those were becoming respectable ways of looking at the world, and they were being promoted in academia. But I had a pretty non-ideological undergraduate degree. But when I became a graduate student, I was quite attracted by all of those theories. I never heard an anti-feminist presentation. I never heard anti-feminist ideas taken seriously at university. So I became a feminist, not because of any personal experience of oppression or feeling that I was made to feel inferior as a woman. Definitely not. Like I'd had super supportive men in my life, very supportive mentors. Had a wonderful father that I love very much. And but I was attracted by radical feminist theory, and I think it's a very seductive sort of worldview. It gives you a sense that you're this righteous victim, and that you have a kind of, it gives authenticity and moral innocence. It gives you a cause. It gives an identity and a collective sense of solidarity with other allegedly oppressed peoples. And I found it very attractive. So while I was doing my graduate work, I identified as a feminist. And I did a feminist PhD thesis on 19th century, mostly Canadian women writers, and early 20th century Canadian women writers. And while I was studying those women and reading their works, I did begin to have certain kinds of doubts, because the feminist perspective is that, women up until a certain point, were voiceless and disempowered, and living under intolerable oppression. But it was pretty obvious to me reading. I read journalists and essayists, and some of them worked as teachers, religious leaders. One of them was a religious philosopher, as well as a crusader for all sorts of causes, such as the temperance movement and the decent treatment of animals and improved factory conditions for working class people. This was a woman who was writing in the 1870s and 1880s, and she was a very important person, and her words mattered. She wrote in all the major Canadian and American periodicals. And I had to admit that she wasn't oppressed. She didn't see herself as oppressed, although she did advocate for some women's causes. And I read other feminists who were similarly situated in, or sorry, not feminists, but well, some of them were moderate feminist writers, but other women writers who they were making an impact on their culture, and their lives were quite full and quite free. And so, my feminism was already being modified at that point, but I still would have identified as a feminist. When I got my first job at the University of Saskatchewan after I graduated with my PhD, that was when things really, the house of cards of feminist ideology sort of fell apart, in that I think I felt ashamed, actually, in a way, to be standing up at the front of a classroom and teaching from a feminist perspective, as most people did, and looking out at the few young men that were left in my classes, because English classes tended to be predominantly women, probably about 80-20 women to men. And, I was looking out at these young men and just thinking what it must be like to be a young man in a university classroom, and having to sit there class after class and hear the same line, whether you were taking literature or sociology or criminology, or religious studies or art history, that the entire world was a world of men dominating women, and that men were responsible for all the bad things in the world. Their sex was responsible for war and inequality and poverty and injustice and violence. And that what they had to do now, sort of in recompense for all the damage that their sex had done, was that they had to take a step back, or 10 steps back, and essentially let their sisters take over, because their sisters were by definition morally superior, innocent of any responsibility for wrongdoing, and capable of much superior leadership, because women were supposedly more empathetic and more collectivist and more egalitarian and had better leadership skills, etc. All the stuff that we still hear today ad nauseum. And that was, very much the orthodoxy when I was teaching. I got my first job in 1999, so nearly 25 years ago, but that was the orthodoxy. And I just started to think how horrible that must be, that even if it were true that up until just a few years ago, men had ruled the world, that, even if that were true, it was a horrific guilt trip, a ridiculous burden to lay on the shoulders of a 19-year-old guy at university, many of whom at the university I was teaching at, came from poor farming families. They, even if some men were responsible for hideous injustice, these guys and their fathers certainly were not. And I also began to doubt that standard line, because, the more I read into history, or just thought about things, the actual facts of war, or the actual facts of how civilization had been built in the West, it was obvious to me that men had not intended to oppress women, that men had sacrificed to build a safe and secure society for their women and their children, and that men had borne many burdens on their shoulders of killing work that wasn't necessarily fulfilling in any way, and of terrible responsibilities. So yeah, the whole ideology really began to crumble for me. And so at that point, I stopped really identifying as a feminist. I didn't, vehemently object, but I realized I didn't want to teach literature through a feminist framework. I didn't want to proselytize to my students. And but it took about another 10 years or so before I really decided that I wanted to speak out on behalf of men. And, during that time, I could just see that the demonization and the dehumanization of men was just a almost incredible injustice that so many people allowed to pass. It seemed that nobody at the university or in the wider society cared about men. And I was actually like, I couldn't believe that men put up with it. And the feminist message was always that these men were, they were privileged, they were entitled, they 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 felt that they deserved access to women's bodies, that they had grown up in a rape culture that told them that dominating and oppressing women was a pleasurable thing to do, and that we needed to lecture them about that. We needed to tell them that women didn't owe them anything. We needed to make sure they got consent at every stage of a sexual encounter, because if they didn't, they deserved to go to jail, and on and on. And I could look at these young guys, and it was just evident that it wasn't so, that they were not privileged and entitled. They were often shamed and uncertain about whether they were even allowed to speak about certain issues. And I just thought that again, even if it had been true that previous generations had been, of men had been entitled and privileged, like, why should that be visited on a generation of young men who weren't responsible for that? And like, it just became obvious to me that it was a kind of class vengeance that was being enacted. So in 2012, I saw that there was a protest at the University of Toronto against a men's rights advocate named Warren Farrell. And I don't know if you know him. He's written a lot of really interesting books about men's issues, and the most famous one is called The Myth of Male Power. I would really recommend it to anybody who's interested in an introduction to men's issues. And he had been a feminist himself, but he was turned off. He was involved in the National Organization for Women and with various feminist groups, but he got turned off by the rabid anti-male animus that permeated the feminist movement. So although he had never become in any way, like, he wasn't an anti-feminist, I wouldn't say. I don't think he would call himself that to this day, but he's really skilled at presenting what all these issues look like from the man's perspective. And so he was speaking, and he's become very interested in the situation of boys and young men, and all the problems that boys are having in school, because the entire teaching of from elementary school right up has been transformed to favor girls. Most teachers are women, of course. Most teachers are feminists. They believe that part of their job as teachers is to encourage girls. Many of them don't really like boys and aren't particularly interested in the way boys learn. They see boys as a problem in the classroom. They think that boys have had it too good for too long, so maybe it's time for boys to sit down and be quiet. And so he's really addressed a lot of these issues, and he was invited to speak at the University of Toronto, which is one of the major universities in Canada. And he was invited by a group called CAFE, the Canadian Association for Equality, which is a group that's interested in men's and boys' issues. And he was prevented from speaking for about an hour and a half by a rabid mob of feminist students who gathered outside the building where he was supposed to speak and prevented people from going in. They formed a human chain around the building so that nobody could get into the room where he was going to speak. And they chanted. They gave the Heil Hitler salute to the security guards who came to try to keep order. They shouted verbal abuse at the few people that were still there trying to get into the the event, and it was just like a ridiculous display of pro-feminist, anti-male hysteria. And when I saw that, that was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back. That was in the fall of 2012, and I just thought, like, this is what campus has become, a place where even a moderate person wanting to talk about the troubles of boys is somehow seen to be a rape apologist or a promoter of the patriarchy. And it was so clear that none of the students who gathered there, and there were maybe 40 or 50 students causing this ruckus, I'm sure not a single one of them had ever read anything by Warren Farrell. They'd been egged on by the professors of their women's studies courses. They'd been given a few phrases of Farrell's taken out of context from a previous book that he'd published, which allegedly made him a rape apologist. And they were spouting these few phrases and knowing absolutely nothing else about him or what he stood for. And so I really realized that the universities had been taken over by an anti-scientific, anti-scholarly, ideological dogma that would brook no dissent and wasn't the least bit interested in truth and certainly not in equality. So I contacted the Canadian Organization for Equality at that point, and I said that I was interested in being involved with them in any way that they'd be interested in having me be involved. And I at that point I thought maybe I could be a mentor for guys at university. Like, I was at the University of Ottawa by that point, and I was a little ways away from Toronto, but I thought perhaps if there were young men at the University of Ottawa who were having trouble in some of their classes, and these classes are places where men are shamed, men are humiliated, they are made to feel that they're somehow uniquely guilty for the sins of the world, and that they should have to apologize for that in their person. And so and if they don't toe the line of feminist dogma, if they try to argue against what their teacher is promoting, or if they try to write their papers in a non-feminist manner, that can cause all sorts of problems for them. And so I thought I could maybe just speak to those guys and try to help them through the experiences that they were having. And at that point, then the Canadian Association for Equality invited me to speak at the University of Toronto, and I went there in the spring of 2013. And there was a protest again, and they pulled the fire alarm, and
Protested you?
pardon me?
They protested you?
Oh yeah,
Oh.
yeah. They protested me. They had posters up all over the place saying, I was going to make the campus unsafe for for women.
Seem like a
I would be somehow.
terrifying. Yeah, you seem very terrifying. You would be.
Yeah. Well, and but it is terrifying to these ideologues if anyone criticizes the orthodoxy, and that's what I was talking about. I was talking about women's studies as a fake academic discipline, and my point was that gender studies programs really have no part of a self-respecting university. They shouldn't be allowed into a university because they aren't interested in knowledge. They are not about pursuing truth. They're not about women's studies. Like, a women's studies course that was genuinely academic would look at the experience of women throughout history. They would look at women's cultural production. They would look at women's art, from a variety of perspectives. They
That's
would aim to be objective.
yeah.
They would include information about evolutionary biology, the findings of evolutionary biology, and how women have evolved over time. They would look at all sorts of things from a variety of perspectives. They would not have an ideological agenda. The point would not be to portray women as oppressed victims and to inculcate students with revolutionary ideals and misinformation about women's real position in society. So that was the argument I was making, and that was unacceptable. And I was also, of course, including some reflection on the injustice to young men at university today. And yeah, that was that was that was very dangerous. And since then, I've given a number of talks at universities. Almost all of them have been protested. I tried to give a talk at my own university in 2014, and it was shut down completely. It never did get completed. We changed rooms. The protesters went into the new room that we found. They wouldn't let me speak. And it's such an interesting position because you see the the utter power, the absolute power of these people who are pretending that they're powerless. They have the power to shut down a talk, and the security wouldn't do anything about it. It was clear that they didn't feel, they couldn't even touch the students. So the students had carte blanche to prevent the talk from going forward. Meanwhile, of course, they're posturing as victims. And it's so ironic because it would never be allowed to happen in the reverse. If a feminist professor was giving a talk about the problems facing girls in our society, and a men's issues group tried to shut it down, or a conservative club protested it, they would be hauled away. Like, they'd be handcuffed and put in a paddy wagon immediately. I've seen students just protesting abortion on university campuses put in paddy wagons and taken away simply for not bothering anyone, standing holding signs with images of aborted fetuses. And that is so unacceptable on a university campus that those students are hauled off in a paddy wagon. But Marxist students, the Revolutionary Student Society, they can shut down a talk, an anti-feminist talk, or a talk about men's issues with impunity. So so that was my sort of introduction to the world of anti-feminism and men's issues, and it's been all
So,
interesting ever since then. I started a YouTube channel critiquing feminism, and I retired in 2019. I took early retirement because I didn't feel like the university was really a place that I wanted to be in. The ideological conformity there is quite striking. And my YouTube channel got shut down. I forget what year that was. I think in 2020 or 2021, I've started up another one. It's not really my channel. It's my friend Steve Brulet's channel, because I don't know how to do any of the technical stuff, just like we were talking about. And I'm essentially doing a history of feminist thought, and I'm now writing a book on the history of feminist thought as well, just to show that even if you simply read the texts that were written by all the major feminist figures going back to 1792 and coming right up into the present, there's no way that you can make the argument that the feminist movement in any of its phases or waves, whatever one wants to call them, you can't make the argument that that movement was ever about equality. It was never about social justice. It was always hateful. It always had a intense repugnance for maleness itself, especially for male sexuality. And it always had corresponding conviction of female superiority that runs throughout all the texts,
so
that is quite startling. And so whenever I hear people say, oh, well, it started off as a good movement, it was reasonable, the first wave, or some people even say the second wave was reasonable, that was just about destroying sexist stereotypes, and then it went wrong in 1970 or in the 1990s. Like, there's always a point at which it went wrong and it got misapplied, but it never was. If you read Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, or you read Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Declaration of Sentiments, or you read any of the tracts about marriage and prostitution that were written in the mid to late 19th century, or you read anything about the suffragettes, like it's startling, the radicalism of even those very early writers. They hated the family. They wanted to destroy the family. They promoted free love. They promoted the idea of children being raised in collectives so that women could be freed from the burdens of raising their own children. They were often influenced by Marxism, and that's there right from the beginning. So yeah, so that's what, I'm kind of interested in exploring. That's my main focus, and men's issues too, because yeah, I'm really concerned about all men, but especially young men today. Like, the laws are so biased against men. Marriage is such a risk now for guys, and the problem of false allegations, false accusations. Like, feminism has really successfully destroyed the presumption of innocence, the right to due process, and when you talk to feminists, like on Twitter or wherever, they're just not they're not honest about any of these things.
Oh,
They're they won't argue in good faith.
mhm.
They and their lack of empathy for men, that because they have this conviction that as a woman they are the righteous oppressed, therefore they don't have to care about men at all. And I've seen that so often in when I've given talks. Like, a woman, I'll give a talk talking about all the issues that are facing young men today. The fact that they're at 40% in university, they're falling behind women in skills acquisition, in employment, in real wages, in job status. They've been discriminated against in affirmative action and equity hiring for 40 years. They're vulnerable to false accusations, sexual harassment policies in workplaces, discriminated against men all the time. Their ability to defend themselves against a claim of rape or sexual assault is being chipped away at, year after year in the law courts. Like, there's so many issues, paternity fraud. And I'll give a talk about those things, and a woman will stand up after the talk and say, well, in 1982, a man put his hand on my thigh
Oh.
and told me I'd be better off to be staying at home having babies rather than working in the law office. And people will applaud her for saying that. And it's like, so what? What is your point? Because one
I'm like,
thing happened to you.
and I'm like, lady, get over it. Like, whatever.
Yeah.
So,
And like,
so
it's
I'm,
it's so striking, like that entitlement that
yeah.
so many women have. It's amazing.
I got a couple questions. I wrote down some notes. So, okay, why is it so bad in the schools? Like, why is gender studies why is the history so manipulated with like your experience being in the education system? Like, if you brought up like I just found out the other day that the first female property owner was in the 1600s, which kind of goes against, like, the feminist in the US anyway. I don't know what it was in Canada, but which goes against like the feminist narrative. So, like, why isn't that stuff like taught in schools? Because you would think they would want people to know that, because that's us, owning property, taking down the patriarchy. Like, why don't they teach that stuff?
Yeah, it's because nothing that goes against the narrative of the woman as victimized innocent is allowed to be taught.
No, but
I think,
do you know why? Like, is it the professors? Is it like the
yes.
principals, or I'm just trying to figure out, like, who's behind this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Something remarkable happened in the late 60s early 70s, as feminists invaded academia. And in a very, remarkably short time with very little pushback, they established women's studies, now called, gender studies programs in the universities, and they established them in, pretty well every single institution of higher education all across North America. And I mean, obviously in Britain and probably elsewhere in the Western world as well, certainly in Australia and New Zealand. And then that ideology that they brought into women's studies spread into every single other discipline. First, it was mainly in the humanities, then it went into the social sciences. They colonized every single discipline. They're now finally taking over the natural sciences, physics, astrophysics. They're all trying to hire women.
How do they
And
take over physics? Like, how do you put a gendered spin on physics?
well, they managed to do so. There are I've read papers about feminist glaciology. I've read, all sorts of crazy feminist spins, but it isn't so much that like in the natural sciences, it's not so much. Oh, certainly biology is being taken over big time. Ideas about gender and whether gender is socially constructed or whether it has a bedrock in nature. That obviously is a very important discipline for feminism and all radical gender theories. But in a discipline like astrophysics, as I understand it, it's not so much that the actual science that's being done is being changed, but what is happening is that they're bringing in ideologues to occupy positions who essentially occupy a separate tier of academia. And what they do is they go around giving talks about how STEM programs have got to become more diverse. They have to include more women, more people of color, etc., more gender queer peoples. And those people, they monitor the climate, not the actual climate, but the atmosphere in those departments. They do surveys about what needs to be done to make women's lives easier in those disciplines. They write reports about how more needs to be done for these oppressed minority groups. That's what they do. That becomes their career. So you have this whole orientation within those disciplines to promote diversity. And how it was allowed to be done, I mean, it's a huge question. I mean, there's an interesting book called the Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, which was published, I think, in 1987 or thereabouts. And he's really talking in that book about this takeover of the university by social justice. And he talks about his experience in the 1960s. And his argument is really that academics lost faith in their disciplines. They lost faith in the relevance of truth seeking and curiosity driven research, and they were ripe to be convinced that becoming a warrior for a cause was more important than actually investigating 16th century French poetry, let's say.
Yeah.
And so, if you ask somebody who teaches at a university, and all of those people, they have this longing for relevance, I think, to feel that they're doing something really important. So if you ask somebody what they're doing and they say, I'm changing the world, I'm making the world safer for women, I'm going to model woman power for the next generation of girls, or I'm making it possible for Black women to believe that they can be astrophysicists. That sounds a lot better than just, I'm researching this one very narrow, specialty topic in a particular field.
And I think it's mean too, to be honest. I like have friends that went into like male dominated fields and a lot of them hate it. Like they're pushed, there's these free scholarships, there's these free grants.
Yes.
They all say women come into engineering, come into all this. And like I have a friend, she spent 300K on an engineering like master's something. Graduated, she's like, I hate this. I don't even like it. Like I don't even think
Yeah.
it's like it's funny because their idea of what we should do, I don't even think is like nice to women because it's like trying to make us into something we're not. Like if you're naturally interested in something, you're gonna find it anyway. You're not gonna, you
Right.
don't need any push.
Exactly. And that was the thing that some disciplines never had a problem attracting women. Women were always interested in English literature because that's the kind of thing that women tend to like. And so there was never an issue of trying to get more women into English literature. But in the disciplines that men tend to like, because they're really focused on numbers and things rather than on people, women tend to be more interested in people related disciplines, and men tend to be interested in the hard number kind of disciplines. To entice women into those areas by telling them that in some way they are striking a blow for all women by entering a field that is has an underrepresentation of women, it doesn't do any favors to the woman. And I think it makes everything worse in the sense that if you get hired on an equity ticket as a woman or as a racial minority, whatever it happens to be, but I'm especially interested in the gender issue. You get hired on an equity ticket, you know it, and everybody else knows it too. And even now, like they still have a lot of positions that they're advertising for women only. Imagine applying for a job that's for women only. You've had your special scholarship, you've been promoted because you're a woman, and now you compete for a job that excludes men from the competition. There's something humiliating about that. There's some recognition there that women can't compete just on an open playing field. So, and then you get hired into that position. And I think there's already an undercurrent of uneasiness and resentment and suspicion, on both sides. And the woman who has that feeling that maybe she's not quite as good or she's there only because she was hired under these special provisions, then she starts to feel uncomfortable. And if she doesn't do that well, instead of perhaps recognizing that she really shouldn't be there, what she's going to do is think, this is because of sexism. I've been made to feel I don't belong here because there's still this invisible but somehow palpable culture of resentment against me because I'm a woman. Then that turns into all sorts of other problems. She ends up accusing one or more of her colleagues of sexual harassment. She's over alert to anything that might seem to be a criticism of her as a woman. I mean, it is a recipe for dysfunction and for allegations against men. And men, I mean, we can say, yeah, it's hard on the woman, but she's never going to be fired.
Right.
The man is the one who then ends up being accused of something, and he loses his job. And he was the brilliant man. I just did a piece, actually, I just wrote a piece in my Substack newsletter about a brilliant astrophysicist, well, astronomer, actually, I think, and a brilliant man, Jeff Marcy. And he was drummed out of his position. Like he was in the running for a Nobel Prize for the kinds of contributions he was making to his field. He was drummed out over extremely vague accusations of sexual impropriety. And we're not talking about sex with students. We're talking about one woman who said he gave her a neck massage when he was driving her home because she was telling him about something that she was tense about. So he started giving her a neck massage, and she got out of the car at that point and she felt uncomfortable about it.
And some
You
of
know,
these chicks don't talk about what they were doing too.
Exactly.
It's
Hmm.
like some of you will be half naked and then men will hit on you and you're like, why did they hit on me? And I'm just like, well, it's a bit, I'm not saying like the student professor thing. I get it, but it's like some of you guys, you look like hookers at work, and then you're mad when they treat you like a hooker at work. Like, I don't know what you expected to happen.
Yeah, the whole sexual harassment industry, which started really going in the 1990s and has been expanding ever since, it's yeah, full of problems in exactly the way that you just put your finger on. But and the issue at universities is really complicated because I mean, when I started university, there were a number of professors at the University of British Columbia where I attended who were married, and they had met as, you know, in professor student relationships. We're not talking about an older professor with an 18-year-old girl, but we're talking about graduate students. Often, you know, they're in their mid 20s, late
Well,
20s.
the poor guy must have just been preyed upon by the women. You know what I mean? What about the guy? He was preyed upon.
Well, yeah, I've talked to a lot of male professors who say that it's not at all uncommon for young women to be really sexually provocative, because, and the fact is, young women are attracted to older men. And even, you know, university professors, maybe they're not the hunkiest sort of guys, but they are men with knowledge, and that is itself very, very attractive to certain kinds of younger women. So there's all sorts of romantic and sexual tension between those constituents. And in some cases, what's wrong with it? Everyone says, oh, there's a power differential. Well, yeah, in a way, but actually not really. If anything, the woman has the power. She has the power to
Have you
accuse.
and have you ever
Sorry?
seen like the have you ever seen the power like a super hot chick just has on men? Like what they
Hmm?
just walk into a room, they'll get whatever they want. It's like they're enticed. Like they act like there's no power in beauty. Like
Hmm. Yes.
what about the beauty power? But they just act like it doesn't exist. There's
Mhm.
no
Yeah.
power being extremely beautiful.
Well, that's you know, that is it. Like the feminist worldview is always like they look with eagle eyes at all the forms of advantage that they think men have, and men's particular types of power. And men do have particular types of power, but they never recognize the power that women have, exactly as you say, the power of beauty, other types of power too, the power to, you know, express distress at something and to have men act on it. I had a friend telling me about once how he was in a workspace, and he and his colleagues, they were all working, and they heard this woman screaming outside, and they all just, you know, without thinking, like just tore outside to try to help whoever, whatever, you know. And it was clearly a woman screaming out. I mean, the entire history of the feminist movement has been the history of women expressing distress, essentially screaming about things that they felt were wrong in their society, and men responding and saying, what can we do about it? That is a very particular form of female power that feminists never recognize. There's the power to accuse. We're now in that era when any woman can accuse any man, and she is listened to. Even if the accusation is quite outlandish, and even if the man absolutely denies, it's still likely that his, at least his reputation is going to be harmed, if not, you know, his entire like professional life, even his liberty, if he ends up being jailed as a result of her accusation. So those particular types of power are incredible. Not to mention, of course, the power to shame men, which feminists and women in general have activated over the years. So yeah, there's, you know, there's all those issues around the promotion of women in universities, and like, and how it actually happened, I don't know. I mean, it's just it was an that ideology just proved so attractive that now there are no universities that aren't dominated by feminist ideals and feminist frameworks of knowledge. And it means that like the whole field of social science has been corrupted. It means that, feminists can cite all sorts of studies about domestic violence, about sexual harassment, about rape, and none of those studies can be trusted. They're all corrupted because they are agenda driven. And I've looked into a few, outrageous claims, and it turns out that like none of the studies on which those claims are based are actually viable. They're not real studies.
How do you
And
tell the
that
difference?
terrible.
How do you tell the difference between like a, because this has happened to me before where someone will like quote a study, and this is why sometimes I just like, I don't need to study to tell me what I see in front of my eyes. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Exactly.
and they'll
Hmm.
give me like
Yeah.
this one debate I did. This guy was like, "Oh, you're misleading people because here's this study that say like women
Yeah.
prefer to sleep with the husband that does the chores." I'm like, Do they
Oh,
really?"
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm like, look at I don't need a PhD in stupid to tell me that like that every woman I know whose husband does everything to make her happy hates her husband for whatever reason.
Yes.
I don't like
Uh-huh.
I just don't, but it's tough because you get into debates with these
Mm.
people, and
Yeah.
it's hard because they'll just bring up these studies that like deep down are not true, but you
Yeah.
don't know how to like disprove that, like how to show
Mhm.
these are clearly ideological studies.
Yes, exactly. And that is the huge problem. Like there is now like a literal army of feminist scholars in every single discipline. They took over journals, they cite one another's research. You can read a feminist paper and it will often have a citation for nearly every single sentence. So it looks as if, wow, I mean, this is, it's rock solid, it seems. But if you actually look into, you go to the link and you read the study, but like who has the time to do that? But if you do, you often find that the studies are flawed in various ways. Now, there is no easy answer to that. Like this is what we're left with after 40 years of agenda driven, ideologically framed research in the universities, is that people can cite studies to defend indefensible positions, and it's very difficult to respond. There is a great book by a woman named Christina Hoff Sommers, and it's called Who Stole Feminism? It was published quite a while ago now, like 1989 maybe, or the early 90s. I can't remember, maybe late 90s. And she actually goes through a lot of the fundamental feminist studies, and she did the research and she shows how they are flawed. And they can be flawed in all sorts of ways, by having a sample size that's way too small, by actually ignoring the responses of perhaps male survey recipients, if it's a case where they're trying to prove that women experience a certain amount of sexual assault, and they don't count the male responses. I mean, there's just all sorts of, they ask leading questions, or perhaps the people that they surveyed are people who volunteered for the survey, meaning that like you advertise saying, I'm doing a study on victims of domestic violence. And so all sorts of victims of domestic violence come forward because they're interested in that study, so it's totally skewed right from the beginning. But the sad fact is that ultimately, it's like so time consuming. Just recently, there was a campaign in my city sponsored by the YWCA. This made me so annoyed. Sponsored by the YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, which is a taxpayer funded organization, gets millions of dollars from the government every year. It was sponsoring a campaign to raise awareness of the number of women who allegedly have traumatic brain injury as a result of domestic violence. It was being sponsored by a guy named Trevor Linden, who was a famous hockey player. He played for the Vancouver Canucks. He was actually the Canucks captain. And he's well known in Vancouver, probably all across North America for hockey fans. And he was talking it up and saying how shocked he had been to learn of the numbers of girls and women who experience concussion. This so-called study claimed that hundreds of thousands of girls and women in Canada every year experience a concussion from domestic violence. It said that for every hockey player, every professional hockey player who has a concussion, 7,000 girls and women get them from domestic violence. So people sent me this and said, like, there's no way this is true. They claimed that up to 92% of the hundreds of thousands of women who experience domestic violence every year, up to 92% of them have concussions as a result. And nobody knows, and we need to raise awareness and we need to get more funding so they can be, properly treated. And people sent me this study saying, like, there's no way this can be true. Everybody would know at least one girl and probably, a dozen who had experienced a concussion. So I actually looked into it, and it's not true. None of it. It's based on it had two major links. One of them was a Statistics Canada study of intimate partner violence, huge survey. And it found that over 4 out of 10 girls and women in their lifetimes will experience intimate partner violence. And that of those 4 out of 10, not up to 92% of them will have a concussion. So that means 3 out of 10 women and girls in Canada are going to have a concussion. Like, really? And so, I looked at how do they define violence? Guess what they call violence? Almost anything. They call violence psychological violence. So if somebody calls you names in your relationship, that's violence. If somebody is jealous and controlling in the relationship, that's violence. If they
Well, and
throw
what is
something at you that
controlling? These ladies will be like, "Oh, I can't go to the club at 2 a.m. He's coercing,
yes.
controlling me." I'm like, "What the fuck?"
Mm-hmm.
They just make
Yeah,
up
I
these
mean,
words that like don't mean anything, and you don't even know what
yeah.
you're saying. They
No,
just
I know. And it's so the violence, I mean, some of this was abuse. Yes, it's not nice to be called names, I suppose, but and that can be very hurtful. I wouldn't recommend it, but it's not going to cause a concussion.
yeah, well,
So
whatever. Like, you didn't call him any names. Like, come on. That's my question. It's like you guys get into these fights and you're just innocent. You can't
Mhm.
fight with someone unless you fight back. You know what I mean? Like, you're just sitting there minding your business, and the men just say, "I'm gonna be an abuser today." Like, I'm sure it happens, but 3 in 10, really?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. And actually put a pin in that point about what the woman has done, because I want to come back to that. But okay, so the whole survey is useless in terms of talking about concussions, because it defined violence so incredibly elastically that it would include anything, even things that couldn't possibly cause a concussion, obviously. And then there was one other where they got the 92% number from. That is even more interesting and sort of frightening. The other study was an American study of 95 Black women who had experienced severe violence. It found that, including violence in childhood right up until their adult lives, it found that 1/3 of those had experienced traumatic brain injury from repeated violence. And specifically, they talked about the types of violence that cause traumatic brain injury, which are choking until you black out and blows to the head. So, but that still didn't explain the 92%. That study referred to another study, which I then went and read. And get this, in that study, they looked at women who had traumatic brain injury and found that 92% of those had received the brain injury from violence. So see, they flipped it around then. So that they took a small sample of women with concussion and found that 92% of those had got it from the domestic violence, then they flipped it around and said that all victims of intimate partner violence, even if that's just someone throwing a cookie at you, that up to 92% of those would experience concussion. Like it doesn't make any sense. And the thing is that the people making those claims, they're either so stupid that they didn't read the studies properly, or they're being deliberately dishonest. And either way, I find it appalling. Like I felt, I mean, and that concussion campaign, it was broadcast all over, like in every major paper in my city and at the national level. Like the YWCA should have to disavow that campaign. They should have to come forward and say that all the numbers that they used were false. Trevor Linden should stand up and disavow the campaign and say he's sorry that he promoted a lie, because those lies are really serious. Those lies mean that people are inclined to believe that all men are violent. That means that every time a man is accused of beating his wife, people are going to say, hey, I remember that campaign that said that hundreds of thousands of girls and women every year suffer concussion from domestic violence. So that bastard is probably guilty. He should be locked up because I'm sure he did beat his wife. And of course, it misinforms women about the reality of men, because the actual fact is that serious domestic violence is a relatively rare phenomenon. It is not hundreds of thousands of women and girls. And to come back to your point, serious studies of the phenomenon have found that women participate in hitting, punching, kicking, etc., both at low levels and at higher levels of intensity, at pretty much gender parity. They participate in it. In fact, some studies find that women tend to initiate the violence more than men
That's
do, and that
that's
makes sense to me.
Yeah, that's what I found out too, just doing the show. Because I've had like I've had like probably 1,000 chicks in and out of here, and I just realized all these bitches crying about abuse. None of them were abused because they all hit for every time I would like dig into it and be like, "What happened?" Sorry for my language, but it's like I just get irritated. They never tell the other side of the story, where it's like
Yeah.
you're coming on my podcast making your ex-boyfriend, who everyone knows, everyone's gonna think he's an abuser now, which, because if you're in a public relationship with him, when you didn't talk about, you hit him first. Like, these feminists, they want to be equal, so be equal, take the hit. Like, you know what I mean? Be
I
equal.
know. Well, it and I was reading this one researcher. He's a sociologist. He looked at 200 studies of intimate partner violence, which did find exactly what you're saying, that the women participate equally and often more so, that they're the ones who initiate the violence. That makes sense to me, in the sense that we as women, like I was never told not to be violent. My parents never said, you should never hit,
Hmm.
anyone that you're involved in. I mean, I was a pretty, pretty girly girl. I wasn't inclined to be very violent, but like the implication is that there are no natural tendencies in girls that need to be curbed. It's always boys. Boys are taught that right from day one. And what this sociologist Murray Strauss, the point he was making was, if feminists were really serious about making homes safer for women, and reducing the number of women who do suffer from serious violence, because of course men are stronger than women, so more women end up being seriously injured and even killed as a result of intimate partner violence, although it is not insignificant. Like men account for about 1/3 of serious injuries, because if you've got a big pot of boiling water or you grab a knife, then that kind of equalizes the gender power imbalance. So men account for about 1/3 of those who are seriously injured, and about 1/3 of those who are killed by their intimate partners. So it's not insignificant.
Wait, men are killed more than, or men are killed more than women?
Oh yes, definitely. I'm talking just
Oh,
about
I didn't know
just
that.
No. Well, men account for about 1/3 of deaths from intimate partner
Oh,
violence.
okay. Okay.
So it's about um, yeah, about 3 to 1 is the ratio of women who are killed by their intimate partners and men. But men generally are the victims of homicide much more often. They're like about 80% of
Yeah.
80 or 85% of homicide victims. But the point Marie Strauss was making was feminists really cared about reducing women's vulnerability to domestic violence. Like factor, the primary indicator of whether a woman is going to be the victim of domestic violence is whether she herself is violent. So
Wow.
one of the first things you would say to women, as a general campaign was, don't hit your partner. If you never hit your partner, your likelihood of being hit drops dramatically. But because feminists aren't really interested, they're not interested in stopping domestic violence. They need it. They need it for their funding. They need it for their ideology. They need it for their
Well,
worldview, which posits that men are violent and women are
I'm
victims.
just to the
So they
point.
don't want to say that.
I'm just to the point. I'm sorry. I just believe no women anymore. Like I've just interviewed like hundreds and hundreds of hundreds. And it's like every accusation, there's never a police report. They never talk. And like whenever I break down the story, it's usually her fault. And I'm like, what world are we living in where we can just throw these baseless accusations? I'm like, I believe nobody. I believe nobody.
Well, I mean, I think a skeptical sort of stance is a good one. One should believe evidence. Like, yeah, it,
I had
like yeah,
one
there's two things
I had
there.
one chick.
Oh,
She said, I was abused. I had an abusive partner. And I was like, "All right, lady, tell me about this abuse. You brought it up, so what happened, lady?" I didn't say I was nicer than that, but you know. And then she tells me that he asked her to leave. She refused to leave his house. So now, lady, you're trespassing. All right. He says, leave, you will not leave. And he pushes her outside and she falls. What?
hmm
And this is abuse? Bitch,
yeah,
get out of the house. Like, what are you doing in the
mhm,
house?
yeah, yeah. I know. I mean, yeah, and that's it. That when I was looking at that StatsCan survey, they have all these different categories of types of violence that the survey, respondents were asked about, and like one of them was, were you ever shoved? And I was thinking, like, there's such a variety of what that could be. Like, yeah, it could be kind of violent for sure. Or it could be that the woman is harassing her man, screaming at him, getting in his face, yelling at him, telling him he's no good, etc. And he finally, like, maybe, she's blocking the doorway so that he can't even get out of the room, and so he shoves her out of the way to, and then that counts as a man being violent to the woman. But the whole context of how it came about is never counted in that survey. So yeah, it's always so complicated. And yeah, I mean, I I feel like the entire believe woman climate that we live in, where every time a woman makes an accusation, everybody, they get their voices get hushed, and the woman all of a sudden has all this authority. I think it's so damaging, not only for men, obviously, but it's damaging for women too. Like, it's like we don't hold women to a high moral standard, and we encourage the worst in
I want
women. We encourage,
I
their
want a new
narcissism.
counter. I want a counter movement called Believe No Women. Or any. I just like believe no women. I just think this is my new campaign. I'm half kidding, you know what I mean? But but
Yeah,
it's just like I don't understand why we have this like default. Like we all
I
know
know.
we are the worst versions of ourselves in a breakup. Like you cannot tell
Yeah.
me like most chicks married, single, whatever, you probably have done something you're not proud of during a breakup at some point in your life. We're human. But now we have the government legally allowing you It's like
Yeah.
if we got men as angry as possible and legally said, here's a gun, you can kill the man you hate the most on the planet, like when they're in the middle of a fight, right? I bet some guys would do it. I feel like that's what they're doing to women. It's like when
Hmm.
we're the worst, I mean, because come on, we can just be spiteful. When we're the worst versions of ourselves, they
Yeah.
legally give us a gun. It's like,
Hmm. Yeah.
why would you do that?
I know, I know. It is really incredible, actually. Um, a friend of mine, that is his metaphor, actually, for what feminism in accordance or in line with the state has done to male-female relations. It's essentially given every woman a loaded gun that she can keep in her bedside table, like metaphorically speaking, although sometimes even physically speaking. And every man knows that it's there, and every woman knows that it's there, or at least anybody who's been paying attention to gender politics over the last 30 years. And how can you have a healthy relationship when you know that the woman can use that gun with impunity? She can accuse her man of whatever. And in Canada, certainly in parts of the United States and other English speaking countries, we have mandatory charging policies where if the woman makes an accusation, if she says, he hit me, etc., even if there's no evidence and the man denies it, the police have to charge the man. And that's the beginning of the end for that guy. And depending on how far the woman wants to go and how she wants to use that accusation, that can be it. If they have children together, she can deny him the right to see his children. He can spend years fighting just to get visitation rights, let alone the right to actually parent his children as he wants to. I mean, it's yeah, it's mind-boggling when you look into how the feminist worldview has translated into just horrific police policies.
Can you so I understand a bit about family court. So, like, I know in family court, at least in the UK, they've switched it to like a balance of probabilities, which means essentially it's like more likely than not likely. So it's not beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
When and then I know they've like expanded the definition of like abuse, rape,
Yeah.
sexual assault. So like we don't really know what any of those words mean anymore. But I don't know as much about like criminal court. Is criminal court more fair than family court?
Well, criminal court is a little better and it still has, beyond a reasonable doubt, but there's all sorts of problems with it as well. I'm not an expert here, so, I can't go into a lot of detail, but from everything I've read, what feminists have done is to chip away at all of the legal avenues that a man can use to defend himself in a court of law against a charge of sexual assault. Of course, it's sexual assault now, which can has a very elastic definition as well. But the man is not able, for example, to use anything about the woman's sexual history as his defense. So it means that much about their previous relationship can be hidden from the jury. And so it's very difficult for him to explain, how he came to the point where he may have done a certain thing that seems unjustified. In Canada, for example, there was a famous trial of a man named Gian Gomeshi, who was a CBC media darling. He worked for the public broadcaster and did interviews, and everybody loved him. All of a sudden, his life fell apart. A bunch of women came forward and accused him of sexual assault. It seemed like it was a slam dunk case. There was a chorus of voices saying he'd done terrible things. And ended up going to trial, three women accusing him. It turned out that everything in their accusations was a lie. They had conspired together to construct the accusations against him. There were text messages between the three of them as they got their stories straight. They were all cases of essentially jilted lovers who were angry that he hadn't treated them very well. They were all interested in getting back with him. The thing that saved him was that he had kept all of his emails and all of his text messages from these women. And so they were asked on the witness stand whether they'd ever contacted him after the alleged assault. And they said, oh no, of course not. It was so painful. I couldn't bear to even, contemplate talking to him. Then the evidence would come forward that, hey, actually, a year later, this particular complainant sent a picture of herself in a bikini to the accused, and was clearly interested in reigniting the relationship. Another one had sent, after a weekend on which he had allegedly raped her, she sent him the following day a bouquet of flowers and said, I love your hands. All sorts of evidence that what had happened, what they claimed had happened, hadn't happened, anything like that. So that's how he proved his innocence. They lied on the stand, and they didn't realize he would still have all of this evidence because these accusations came years after the alleged assaults. So now in Canada, there's been an attempt, and in fact, it's been successful, to make it that text and email evidence cannot be introduced into the man's defense unless it's cleared with the prosecution and the judge. Now, what that means is they're claiming that this is to protect the woman's privacy because a lot of these personal exchanges, they're confidential information, private information. So now the defense will have to bring forward all the evidence that they have, and they'll have to present it to the prosecutor and the judge. That means the prosecutor will know what the defense has in its arsenal. The prosecutor will communicate that to the accusers or accuser, and she will be able to construct her story around the knowledge of what emails and text messages he has. That's just one of the ways that feminist activists are chipping away at the man's ability to make a full defense against a claim of sexual assault. And that is just remarkable, and yet that is being allowed to pass. So the whole idea of the presumption of innocence, it's still there in criminal court more than it is in family court. In family court, basically, you can make any kind of accusation and it doesn't have to be proved at all. You can just say, he threatened me, or even, I fear for the safety of my children. And that may be enough to convince a judge. And of course, most judges, they're terrified of being too lenient and then having something happen to that woman, and then everyone will accuse him of endangering her. So judges are very concerned to side with the woman in the vast majority of cases. But in the criminal court too, you can see how the man's ability to defend himself is being weakened.
So when it comes to, you mentioned that feminists basically rewrite history. Or they don't talk about like historical women that have been influential in history and act like we were oppressed. Can you tell me a bit more about how feminists basically rewrite history?
Well, I mean, everything is filtered through the feminist lens, and feminists are not really interested in objectively portraying the situation of women historically or the situation of women, in the present day. They're interested in promoting their agenda, and I can understand, like, if you believe that horrific abuses are occurring every day all around us and have occurred throughout history, then it seems a fairly small thing to bend the facts to fit your narrative.
Yeah, because
And
They'll all say all the women were just being beaten and abused and they just couldn't get divorced and that's why they were married. That's like the whole, like whenever I bring up that women were married 100 years ago, like 85% of women were married or people, they all say that it's because of like the women just like getting beaten and they're not able to leave and their husbands were just raping them. Are you saying that's not
Mhm.
true?
Well, we don't like there are some things we really don't know about the lives of ordinary women in the 19th century. Our avenues to really fully understanding individual women's lives are actually quite limited. But when you read diaries of women from the time, you get quite a different picture when you read the journalism that women wrote in those days. I mean, women, I know you made this point, I think on the Pierce Morgan uh, interview, whatever that was. By the way, I wanted to say I thought you did a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And that, like, I was interviewed by him once years ago when he was on Good Morning Britain, and I hate those situations. Like you have such limited time to say anything, and they
Yeah.
sort of, they put you on the spot, and then and a feminist like cuts you off and makes some dismissive comment. But I thought you handled it well, and I liked your whole demeanor was so different from the other woman, Ava or whatever her name is, that she was so just so unpleasant. And yeah, yeah.
Well, even
But
her, I'm just so tired of hearing about how we couldn't do anything and there weren't smart,
yeah.
influential women. I'm like, there
Mhm.
absolutely were.
There
Like,
were. Yeah, that's it. I know that's what's so it's so fascinating. Like it's this idea that up until about 1975, women were just trapped in their homes. They were voiceless. They were utterly powerless. They couldn't affect their society. And that was the thing when I turned my thesis into a book. Um, like I couldn't write it as a feminist book anymore, really, because it was impossible to ignore the power that those women had. Like one of the women that I wrote about, I still think she's a wonderful person. She was born in 1864, and so she was born half a century before women had the right to vote, but she didn't see herself as oppressed at all. And she wasn't. She went to she was not wealthy. She did not inherit money. She wasn't in exceptional circumstances. She grew up in a lower middle class small town in Ontario, and she went to the Brantford Collegiate, which was a okay post-secondary institute. And she became a journalist at a very young age. She started to write for the Globe newspaper, which became the Globe and Mail, that still exists today. She wrote for the Washington Post, which of course it's a major leftist paper now. And she lived in Washington for a time. She wrote social commentary. She wrote book reviews. She wrote theater reviews. Like she did all sorts of things. She was basically given a free hand. She was in her early 20s at the time. She was intelligent, she was lively, she attended feminist conventions with a skeptical eye. Like she was sort of a moderate feminist. Her point was that women would need to know a heck of a lot more about world affairs and basic things like economics and the political system than they did at present if they were going to ever be responsible voters. And so that was the point she made. She thought she would be a pretty good voter, but she had some skepticism about whether most of her fellow women would be. But she had no sense that like there were no avenues of endeavor that were closed to her. And we're talking about the 1880s. She actually said that it was a golden age for girls, full of opportunities. She worked as a teacher. She had a friend who became a professor of medicine. She had another friend who became a doctor. Like all of those professions were opening to women. And yeah, the idea that that women were struggling and oppressed. Yeah, some women had a terrible time. Poor women had a terrible time, and so did poor men. And it's the fact that the feminist movement is utterly incapable of recognizing that, yeah, if you're going to talk about the disabilities and difficulties of a group of people's lives, you can only do it responsibly if you compare it to other people's lives, in this case, to men's lives. And men's lives were very, very difficult. Many men, of course, in the 19th century didn't have the right to vote either. That fact alone, to me, is like the fact that I didn't know that when I was writing my PhD dissertation, including on the suffrage movement. I had no idea, and nobody told me, and none of the sources talked about the fact that many men were barred from voting. There were property and income qualifications in place throughout the English speaking world, and no feminist ever cared about those. And it puts the whole issue into an entirely different light.
Yeah. No, go
And they
ahead.
don't do, oh, sorry.
Oh no, I say go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, and the other thing is that like feminists don't do they don't do justice to the anti-feminist position, which was complex and interesting. Um, One of the questions that was often asked at the time to women who were arguing they should have the right to vote at the federal level, and by the way, like women all, well, at least for a long time, could vote at like the municipal level. They could vote on school boards, things like that. In the United States, various states did grant voting rights at the state level to women. It was just at the
What
federal
a
level
mistake.
that,
The mistake.
yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, and this is the question. And, there are all sorts of issues that have to do with the vote. Why were so many women either not interested or quite strenuously opposed? I mean, for one thing, they felt that most of the women who were active in support of women's suffrage, most of them were had an anti-male agenda, and so they were concerned that those women would drive politics and social ideas that would drive a wedge between men and women. And hey, guess what? That's exactly what happened. They lied about men. They were involved in that cause partly, or even maybe primarily, because they were angry about men. Men do have different responsibilities in their societies that make an argument for why perhaps they should also have certain privileges, certain political privileges. And this was something that was asked many of the feminist advocates for the vote. They would say, the ballot is in some ways a substitute bullet, in the sense that politics is war by another means. If you are a voter, that means you are taking responsibility for the direction of your country. If for some reason, as a result of political decisions that the voters have made, if it results in civil war, if it results in a war with another country, male voters are the ones who are going to have to shoulder that horrific burden. They're the ones who are going to have to step forward and potentially sacrifice their lives to protect their countries.
So what do you say to the women that say, well, we haven't had a war in 50 years?
Well, there's a war going on right now in Ukraine, and it's not clear that the whole world won't be drawn into that in one way or another. It certainly seems as if the United States is itching to turn that war into a much larger conflagration. And we saw what happened. All the women, or many of the women, left Ukraine, and the men are forced to stay behind and fight. So you can see a very stark difference there in terms of the roles and responsibilities of men and women. Now, nobody's necessarily saying that women should be soldiers. I think that would actually be pretty disastrous in all sorts of ways. So, but what about that distinction? Like, how do you justify claiming that you care about equality when most feminists do not want women to have to register for the draft? And I don't think they should either. Like, I don't think the society is even prepared to see women's bodies coming home in body bags. The society's not prepared to see women with their arms amputated as a result of their involvement in battle. Like, the differences in how we look upon men's and women's bodies, the different ways we value men and women are so stark. It's a lie to pretend that those differences don't exist. And I was just reading a couple days ago about the sinking of the Titanic, and how that was 1912. So it was right during the time when the whole suffrage argument was going on. And there was, again, a really stark illustration of the different ways that men and women relate to public sacrifice, and the different ways that men and women's lives are valued. When that ship went down, about 75% of women survived. It would have been much higher if there hadn't been women in the lower decks, in the steerage passenger area. 97% of first class and something like 86% of second class cabin passengers, women survived, and only about 20% of men survived. So
Wow.
that was the difference. And the crew stood with pistols loaded to make sure that women and children got onto the lifeboats before men. And you read the stories about men, kissing their wives goodbye and knowing that they were never going to see them again, and preparing for their deaths with dignity. And afterwards, people did actually talk about these issues. Like, in some anti-feminists said, well, feminists, so what do you want? Do you want equality, or do you want to survive when the ship goes down?
Well, that
And
was that was a turning point for me when I realized like you can't have equality. Like the whole basis of equality, like men and women can't be equal because we can't do what they can do.
mm,
So I'm like, there's no way like that we can never get what they're hoping for. Like,
yeah.
especially, I found out, I did research after the Pierce Morgan interview. If you include like farm, and you might know this, like you've done so much research, but like when you include like farming, when you include like truckers, when you include all the infrastructure of society, it's 45% of men have infrastructure jobs. And that doesn't even include like there's like one or two, I can't remember what it was. There's one and two industries where it was kind of like, do we need them? Do we not? We'll just say no. Like I didn't include like
Mhm.
store owners, like stuff like
Mhm,
that, which
right.
you could argue
Yeah.
also includes the infrastructure. So, and only 7% of women do. And let's just be honest, like, do we need those like 2% of women in the police department? Like,
Yeah.
do we really need them? And that's what I realized. I was like, they pay 72% of the taxes. So it's like they're paying all the taxes, they're running society. Like, why aren't we fighting for it to actually be equal?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you don't hear a lot of feminists clamoring to to have equal representation in sewer working, and roofing and construction jobs, and the
Well, even
dangerous, dirty, smelly, horrible really, I mean, 97% of workplace fatalities are borne by men. Do women want that to be 50% female?
and even the jobs they want, like the CEO positions. My dad was a
Mhm.
CEO of like 250 people roughly.
Hmm.
And I'm like, women don't want to work as much as he did. Like he would go to India for 2 weeks at a time. He would go to the office at like 3 in the morning to talk to the people because he had software developers in India. And so he would like
Mm,
work in the middle of the night. I'm like,
mm,
I'm a pretty hard worker, but I cannot work
yeah.
like my dad did. And it's like these feminists, they just want like to look cool. I feel like it's just for Instagram sometimes. Like they just want to look cool in these jobs, look pretty, and like they don't want to like what percent of feminists want to work 80 hours a week?
Yeah, I know.
None of
Yeah.
them. I don't want to work 80
Yeah.
hours.
No, I know. And that's what I find so hypocritical is that it's like they want the job, they want the job. They want that idea of having that job. But they don't actually want to do what's necessary to have the job. And and then if they do get the job, often through some sort of process of being selected because they're women, because a lot of law firms want to have a woman on in the firm or a couple of women. And it was even law in California for a while that every corporate board had to have a woman on it. Otherwise, it would be fined some very large sum. So, for a while there, I think there were there were CEOs going around, get me a woman. I need a woman on this board. So that idea of some sort of forced representation seems to be very, very attractive to women. But then once they get into those positions, they start complaining about how difficult it is. And then
Oh,
they want things to change for
they
them.
want to be in a man's world, but when they're treated like a man, they go to HR. It's like if
Mhm.
women left the workforce tomorrow, we would have no HR because women are just like we just whine. It's like I when I start hearing about these HR, I used to sell I used to work in like plumbing tech. So I would go to like a plumber's like training centers and we would like show them how to use plumbing products. Like I didn't know anything about it. I was just selling the stuff, you know what I mean? And
Mm,
but it was an all male environment. Like I think there's maybe one or two women in the whole like plumbing training, whatever. And they were very
mm.
masculine women. Like they might have like butch, you know what I mean? And I just couldn't believe how those men talked to each other. They were so mean. They would just bully the hell
Right.
out of each other. And I'm thinking like that's a man's world. But if this
Yeah.
happened to any woman, if women were
Hmm.
bullied like that, they would be in HR the next day,
Yeah.
whining, suing, crying sexism. When I'm like, that is the mean. I forgot what they were saying to this one guy, but I felt so bad for him. That's just how
It
guys
can be
talk.
brutal.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm just like,
Yeah.
be in it. Be in it.
Yeah.
They don't want
Be in
that.
it, but they don't. No, and that's like the story of what has happened to so many workplaces over the last 40 years is that women demanded access. And then once they got in there, they realized they didn't like the climate that was there. And so then they started complaining. They didn't like that one guy had a girly calendar up in his office cubicle, so they said that was sexual harassment. He had to take it down. They didn't like it that men made certain types of jokes. And so, they complained about
Take
it
away sex
and
jokes from men. Why would you guys do men love that shit. Like,
yeah, I know. I mean, and so it is really incredible. It's like, there used to be this idea that there were separate spheres, that women sort of ran the home and men had their workspaces. But gradually, most men's workspaces have been feminized. And yeah, it's so unfair and hypocritical.
what like what policy changes would you like to see when it comes to like advocating for men's rights?
Well, yeah, I guess on the most basic level, I would like it to become impossible for, I mean, this isn't a policy change per se, but I would just like it to become impossible for women to express hatred against men. Or at least I would like it that it would become unthinkable that women who lie about men, who lie using statistics, or who openly express their hatred against men would be laughed out of the room because I find that so unforgivable. There are just even to confine it to academia, there are so many women. If you look on their Twitter feeds, for example, or look at the articles they write. There's a professor named Susanna Walters at Northeastern University, I think, who she wrote a whole article in the Washington Post called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" with a big picture of Harvey Weinstein on the front.
So,
And you think, is this going to be is it going to be satirical in some way? Is there going to be a twist at the end where she says, no, actually, I don't hate all men? That would be ridiculous. No, it is a crude, simplistic statement about why it is morally justified to hate men and why women are morally
wow,
superior.
this
Yeah,
is
I mean, it's just,
real.
yeah, it's real. Yeah, it's
Wow.
incredible. That I think it was back in 2017,
Okay.
and it's a horrible article. She basically says to men, you deserve to be hated, all of you, but if you want us to not hate you for all time, here's what you have to do. You have to step away from the power. You have to never take powerful positions. You have to vote for feminist women. You have to do this and that, and then maybe we won't hate you for all time. That's just a classic feminist
Wow.
stance. We'll tell you whether you can ever get to the point where we will forgive you for being part of the class of men. But for right now, we hate you, and we will continue to hate you as you grovel before us and try to make amends for the original sin of maleness. And that's just classic. Now imagine that this woman, she's not, they always talk about incels, incel forums, men's rights forums, and how they express hatred towards women, all that sort of thing.
This
This
idea.
woman,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just, yeah, this woman, she is a very, very important, powerful woman. She's a sociologist. She's a gender studies professor. She was, at the time anyway, the editor of Signs Journal, which is a very important feminist journal. She teaches students, hundreds of students every year, and she spews this kind of hate. Imagine being a man in her class and knowing she hates all men. Imagine being a colleague of hers, a male colleague, and she's voting on your promotion or tenure. Like and she's just one. There's a woman named Christine Fair, forget what university she's at. She wrote about her tweets are quite famous. She absolutely hates, MAGA hats. She compares them to, I don't know, statements of male supremacy. And she said it during remember when Brett Kavanaugh, the hearings, the Senate hearings for his confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court was going on, and he was being accused by Christine Blasey Ford of having, when he was 16 years old, allegedly assaulted her or tried to assault her at a party. And this woman, Christine Fair, tweeted that any man who voted for Brett Kavanaugh should be killed, should have his genitals cut off and fed to pigs. And that's just that kind of that level of hatred, especially around the Me Too movement, when all of that was going on in 2017 and 2018. That's just standard at universities. The University of Regina had a what was it called? A toxic masculinity. No, it's called a masculinity confession booth that they set up, where men were supposed to go to confess their sins of toxic masculinity. I thought it was a joke at first. I thought it was
Wait,
an
is
anti-feminist joke.
is this recently? I want to go.
Not that recent. It was, I think, in 2017, something around
What?
there, 2018.
You're giving me good
Uh,
content. I'm gonna cover some of these.
I mean, it's so
Crazy.
incredible. I mean, I've like documented all this stuff over the years. There was a professor at St. Mary's University in Eastern Canada named Judy Haven. She actually made a serious proposal that in all university classes in Canada, it should be policy that women be called on first. And so they should be allowed to speak first in every university classroom, because women's voices were being silenced allegedly. And men would have to be would have to just take second class status and maybe speak only when all the women had finished. There are professors. There's one at the University of Alberta, a woman named Lise Gottel, who involved herself in a campaign with the RCMP called "Don't Be That Guy." And it was a series of posters allegedly telling young men, because they're so stupid and so brutish and so crude in their thinking and behavior, telling them things like, if a woman is passed out drunk, you shouldn't have sex with her. And they would have these crude statements like, just because you helped her home doesn't mean you get to help yourself. And it would
Wait,
show a woman.
was Brock Turner innocent?
Oh, Brock Turner. I did a video on him. Well, nobody knows. It was a case where it was reported that he had sexually assaulted a woman while she was passed out behind a dumpster after outside of a frat house. That was the reporting. So everybody said, well, hey, that's a very clear-cut case of sexual assault. She's passed out. He has sex with her. Obviously, he's a brute, and he should be locked away for the next 20 years. The actual facts of the case don't support that at all. He was discovered lying with this woman outside the frat house, not behind a dumpster, I don't think, by two cyclists who were coming by and saw something and yelled at him, and he got up and went running because two huge guys were charging at him, and that was taken as proof that he was guilty. In fact, he never sexually assaulted her. He seems to have digitally penetrated her. So in other words, he had his finger on her vagina.
Wait,
And
that's it?
yes. So it wasn't quite as, still, if she was passed out and, he's fingering her, I suppose you could say that wasn't a good thing to do. But the reality of it was, it
Oh,
was
well,
so
my
much more
question, how did
complicated
she
than that.
get to the dumpster?
Well, exactly. The narrative was that she got so drunk that she was, slurring her words and couldn't speak, and he somehow hauled her outside because he wanted to assault her, and then proceeded to assault this
All right.
poor incapacitated girl. The reality, as far as I could tell, I read all the police reports, I read all the witness statements, like nobody saw him taking a passed out girl, out of the party and, dragging her out. Everybody saw him and her together. They were both drinking. She was drunk, it seems, but that he was drunk too. It seems as if what happened was that the two of them were drunk at this party. They went outside to make out. They, I don't know what, collapsed together in a drunken heap while they were kissing and fondling, etc. And it's quite possible that at that point she kind of went to sleep, passed out, etc. Who knows what? I mean, that is known to happen. Sometimes even the best of us fall asleep while we're kissing and fondling if it's really late at night and we've had a few drinks. So the fact, and he was drunk himself. Nobody knows when exactly she passed out, and that is obviously of the issue. If she passed out after the cyclist came along and saw what was, saw these two people together, then he wasn't sexually assaulting her at all. It was two drunken young people having, something. And so, yeah, the idea that he would have to register as a sex offender for 10 years, that means, any employer can look him up and see that there he is. I mean, his name, of course, is all over the internet. He'll never live this down. It's going to be with him forever. Yeah, like nobody knows the details. Like she claims that she completely blacked out. So she doesn't remember any of it. But, a lot of people who drink a lot do black out, but that doesn't mean that they weren't quite, like, quite like not drunk acting, if you know what I mean. Like if you drink a lot regularly, you can black out, but people who conversed with you at the time wouldn't necessarily think you were that drunk. So that's quite possible too. He had no reason to think that she wasn't consenting, that she wasn't interested in him. And,
Okay, this
it,
one's on
it,
the
it just
news. This one's on the news. Larry Nasser.
is, is he the,
The
no,
gym.
I don't know that. I don't think I know that case. Is he the gymnast
Yeah,
coach?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't that one I don't know as well. I never looked into that in as much detail. So I couldn't comment on it.
Weinstein.
Yeah, Weinstein. Well, everybody has an opinion on Weinstein, right? I mean, what can you say about that? These were women who had long-term relationships with him. One of them,
Hey,
like I
they had
researched this. Yeah,
long-term relationships with him.
yes, one of them in particular, I researched this at the time, but it was a number of years ago, so I can't recall the exact details. But one of them, like they have a whole history of her, sending him emails, "Love you, big guy," things like that. Um, Long after the alleged rape, she continued to see him regularly. She told friends about, how much she enjoyed spending time with him. I think the same is for the other accuser. So if these were cases where, well, it just seems pretty obvious that this was transactional sex of some sort, and that those women who later, in some cases, many years after the fact, claimed that it was a sexual assault, that it meant something quite different in the moment.
Wow.
He was an extremely powerful man, obviously. Anyone who wanted to work in one of his movies would have known that having sex with him, or at least flirting with him, etc., was a route to success in Hollywood and the opportunity to work in one of his films. Like, I don't think after the fact that kind of transactional sex, where the women made it clear to him that they were very interested in what he had to offer them, and he made it clear to them that he was interested in what they had to offer him. I don't see how that can be reinterpreted after the fact, sometimes 10 years, 15 years after the fact, as sexual assault for which a man should have to spend years and years in prison. I just find that incredible. One thing that was really interesting to me about that story was, again, like all the feminist justifications. Oh, these women, they had no choice. If they wanted to work in his movies, they had to sleep with him. Everybody knew that was the way it was. It was a terrible thing, but it shouldn't be allowed to stand. I mean, they did have a choice. Working in one of his movies wasn't their only option in life. And again, they always have to lie about things, like the fact that of the long-term relationship sort of, it to me completely invalidates the claim that this was a sexual assault. And they brought in a woman named Barbara Ziv, a forensic psychiatrist, to claim that when women's stories of rape don't fit the standard narrative, we should make all sorts of excuses for those women. She claims that rape trauma causes women to behave in ways that seem inconsistent with victimization, but we shouldn't therefore conclude that they were willing or that they weren't victims. So basically, Ziv's feminist interpretation is that when women lie, when their stories keep changing, when they continue to associate affectionately and lovingly with the man they claim raped them, when they do all of these things that might lead us to conclude that actually it wasn't rape, it was a consensual relationship. She says that whenever we encounter that from an alleged victim, we should understand that it's her trauma that is causing her to lie, have an inconsistent story, or maintain a loving relationship with the man she says raped her. That's the stage at which we have arrived in feminist reasoning. So there is absolutely nothing that an alleged rape victim can do that would convince anyone, according to the feminist story, that should convince us that she's lying. In fact, if if her story doesn't make any sense, that's proof that she's a rape victim. So, it's heads you win, tails I lose. Except for the feminists, it's their story is always the one that should stand. And yeah, I don't know how you can take seriously a movement that's founded on those kinds of profound contradictions, but people do. And the interesting thing is that that's always been the way. I would really encourage anybody who's interested in the history of feminism and critique of feminism to read a guy named Ernest Belfort Bax. He was a journalist, a barrister, and a socialist in the late 19th century in England. And he wrote a whole bunch of essays and 2 books about feminism. One was called The Fraud of Feminism, and the other was called The Legal Subjection of Men. They're both fascinating books. One published in the late 19th century, I think 1896. The other published in the early 20th century, 1913 or thereabouts. In The Legal Subjection of Men, he argues that it's men who are discriminated against in law, especially in marriage. And he was a barrister. He saw all sorts of court cases. And his point, he was arguing in response to John Stuart Mill, who published a book called The Subjection of Women in 1869. And so Bax was saying, all these complaints by women about marriage and how women are turned into property and they don't have any rights in marriage. He said it's the exact opposite. As far as he could tell, it was men who surrendered their own autonomy in marriage. And he gave all sorts of examples of how the law was biased, not against women, but in favor of women. He talked about a whole variety of crimes that women couldn't even be prosecuted for because there was just no interest in prosecuting women for certain types of crimes, and especially in marriage. For example, a woman could not be prosecuted for slandering her husband or libeling her husband, whereas if a man slandered or libeled his wife, he would be prosecuted. He made the point that in cases of domestic violence, a woman could do nearly anything to her husband, and he would only be laughed at if he attempted to go to police. He said that if a woman set her husband on fire, most people would believe that he deserved it. And if he went to the police about it, at most, they would levy a fine against his wife, and he would have to pay the fine because, of course, a husband was responsible for all his wife's debts. Many men went to debtor's prison because they were unable to pay their wives' debts. That was the kind of responsibility that a man took on in marriage. He talked about the fact that if a woman murdered her husband, she usually got off because she would claim that her husband had been abusive. If a man murdered his wife, it wouldn't matter,
Same in the 1800s, this kind of stuff.
Yes, he's talking about the late 1800s. And so that's the fascinating thing. We always think, oh, maybe the pendulum has swung too far. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, women were discriminated against in law. Now men are discriminated against in law. No, that's what Bax is saying.
Have men ever had the upper hand in law?
Well, that's a complicated, very complicated question. Yeah, the feminist claim is that when husband and wife, when a man and woman married and they became one person, that the man had the upper hand in various ways. And there were issues, like the issue of a woman's property in marriage. That fluctuated throughout the 1800s. Women got more and more rights over any property that they brought into marriage as the century developed and as feminist advocates pressed their case. So men did have certain privileges at various times, but also certain responsibilities, such as the responsibility to look after their wife and to provide for her, even if she left him. This is a point that Bax makes. If a woman left a man for whatever reason, he still bore the responsibility of paying her debts and looking after her. So there were all sorts of ways that men had these legal responsibilities that women didn't have. And the other point that Bax makes, he describes the whole climate of opinion about men and women, and how like the society simply could not take women's crimes or misdoings seriously. It did not. It couldn't believe that when women did wrong, that they were really responsible. And so he points out that infanticide, the killing of babies under 1 year old, was a common crime that women committed.
No way.
And yet, yes, there's one professor, Pauline Pryor at the University of Belfast, a professor of social policy. She's done a paper on women being tried for the crime of infanticide. She points out that it was such a common crime in the United Kingdom, the United States as well, that some sociologists estimate that 61% of all homicides in the 1800s were of children under 1 year old. And the vast majority of the killers of those children were their mothers.
Wow.
And yeah, and juries were very reluctant to convict women of this crime because they felt sorry for them. They would, and many of the women were probably quite pitiable. They were poor women. Some of them were not married, but many of them were married. But just like the difficulty on the part of the public of believing in female evil was very, very deeply entrenched. So the woman would always be able to make a defense that either she was desperate, she was in a desperate situation of some sort, and that led her to commit the crime, or she wasn't in her right mind. That was the temporary insanity kind of defense. She didn't know what she was doing. And in many, many cases, in the majority of cases, the woman would be acquitted of the crime because juries, all male juries, couldn't bear the thought of sending a woman to prison. And often, they felt very sorry for her. And this didn't only apply to women who were unwed mothers. There were many women who were married and who killed their children as well. And they were
Why
very
do women
rarely
like to
convicted.
kill babies so much? Like, what is it like? What is it with us?
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know. That's a big thing. Yeah. Yeah. And even in those days, feminists came to the defense of the killers rather than the defense of the babies. So although feminists always put themselves forward as women who had greater empathy for children, etc., were by nature more nurturing than men, when women committed those types of crimes, they would make up excuses for why they did, or argue that they hadn't known what they were doing, etc. So the moral double standard that we notice in our own society now was very much active then too. Women were supposed to be morally superior to men, less violent, more empathetic, etc. But at the same time, when they committed crimes, they were thought to be not responsible for them. And that's the same today. If you read, there's a really interesting study by a woman. She's a law professor at the University of Michigan, I think. And her name is, anyway, I don't know, can't remember where she is exactly, but her name is Sonia Starr, Starr. She wrote a definitive study in 2013 of the gender gap in criminal sentencing, and found that women on average for the same crimes, and she did all sorts of calculating, to determine what qualified as a similar crime. But for the same crimes as men commit, women are sentenced 60% lighter than men. So, and that's only at the sentencing point. She also found that women are far less likely than men to be arrested in the first place, far less likely than men to be charged in the first place. If they are charged, they're far more likely to be able to have the charges dismissed or to strike some sort of plea deal. And they're far more likely than men to be to serve what's it called when you don't actually go to jail, like you serve a suspended sentence, you do community service or something like that. So the gender disparity in the criminal justice system is massive, and that's why we have 95% of the prison population being male. And even then, if you put into Google like a phrase like program to keep women out of prison, you'll find all sorts of newspaper articles and organizations that are dedicated to keeping women out of prison, even though the percentage of women in prison is like a tiny proportion of that of men. And almost nobody cares about keeping men out of prison. So we just have this idea in society that women's violence it's not a concern. I don't know. They're just, we just have trouble taking seriously female evil. And that was another thing I wanted to just end with Bax, just to go back to him very briefly. He in the fraud of feminism, he talks about how it irritated him so much that women were able to literally get away with murder and make all these claims against men, and that both men and women tended to believe them. Just like now, women always have had greater in-group empathy for other women, and men have more empathy for women than they have for other men. So that's why feminism has succeeded so, beyond anybody's imaginings. And Belfort Bax made the point that there's this contradiction in feminist claims that runs right through all feminist advocacy. There's two different basic arguments. On the one hand, women will say, women are equal to men, we deserve equality, and whenever there is any kind of disparity in outcomes, that's because of sexism. And we demand that disparity be addressed. We still hear this all the time now. So in the few STEM fields where men still outnumber women, feminists will come forward and say, this is a clear example of sexism. We need to get more women into biochemistry. They never say anything, of course, about the fact that in the education faculty, women outnumber men, 8-2. So there's that, the equality argument. He called that the political feminism. But on the other side, there's always this sentimental feminism, as he called it, which is the argument that women are different from men and they deserve to be treated with, special kid gloves, with special empathy, with a special understanding for their difficult circumstances, with a, special intention to help them more than we would tend to help men. So how can the two of them, are women equal? Or are women special and different and requiring special treatment? Well, feminism always has it both ways. And we're in the pickle we're in today, partly because of that.
No, I think the feminists really just want equal prisoning sentences. They're really dying to do the plumbing, the electricity. It's
Yeah.
so crazy. They're just very
Hmm.
eager. I'm waiting for the blondie on Pierce Morgan to apply next door. I've got her an interview and everything. I'm waiting.
Very good. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, no, they're just not interested in real equality. And yeah, that's it, it is just maddening. It really is. And you realize when you argue with any of these people, like on Twitter or in an interview situation like you had with Pierce Morgan, like they don't even try to argue in good faith.
mhm.
They just fall back on these standard claims. Well, men invented X, or men control X, so men should have to do whatever. Like, after the Titanic sank, and there was this huge loss of life of men, and and so many men had accepted their burden as men to die so that some women could get on the lifeboats. Some people paid tribute to men for sure and said, this is an example of why we live in a patriarchy, because men do bear this special kind of responsibility. But many feminists said, look, if women were in charge of the ship, and I'm not kidding you, there are on record, there's a fascinating
No.
study of the cultural history of the Titanic. Some feminist journalists actually wrote and said it was men who built that ship. So naturally, it should have been men who died. And if women were building ships, women
Oh,
would build them much better than men, because women care more about saving lives. And women would have made sure that there was nothing wrong with that ship and it would never have gone down. Like, they literally wrote that in response because they couldn't stand the occasion of having to acknowledge male self-sacrifice. And that, like, it's so much the victim mentality, because when you have that victim mentality, and, like, researchers have studied this, that you get so into your own identity as a victim that you literally are become incapable of feeling empathy for anybody outside your particular victim group. And you can see that in all of these feminist advocates throughout history, from 200 years ago to today, that they had that inability to feel empathy. So they could literally kill somebody in the out group and still see themselves as the victims. That was the other thing that Back said too, that he was always struck by, because he observed many, many, many criminal trials in his role as a barrister, and he said that he was always struck by the fact that female criminals, much more than male criminals, always had this air of injured innocence, even when it was obvious that they had done the crime. They would almost never admit it. They would always blame someone else. They always felt that people were out to get them, and that, they were being unjustly persecuted. He said most male criminals, you could get them to admit that they'd done wrong, but there was this sort of disordered morality, this conviction of immaculate, perfection on the part of these female criminals, that they somehow could avoid admitting to themselves what they'd done. And I don't know whether that's something that women are more vulnerable to, that even while we're always proclaiming how we're more empathetic, etc., that actually we may have a more disordered sense of moral standards, or we tend to excuse ourselves for wrongdoing more
oh yeah.
easily. I'm not, I,
Oh,
that,
oh,
and
I believe that. I'll tell no that hundreds of women, anything, anything that makes women look bad, there's always an excuse. I've done shows on this. When do the excuses run out? When is it just this was a bad choice? It's always, well, why did she cheat? Well, why did she divorce him? Well, why
right.
did she do this? It's never, yeah, that probably wasn't a good move. It's a like I don't know what it is, but it's like the gut reaction of women is to blame someone else. I
Right.
100% believe that.
Yeah. And it seems like society as a whole aids and abets that
Yeah.
tendency, because I've noticed that too. Like, if a man commits a horrific murder, if he murders, like, especially if it's one of those family murders, he kills his wife and his children, nobody tries to offer any kind of mitigating circumstances or excuse for him. And yeah, nobody does. And anybody, if anybody even attempts to do so, there was a case in Australia a couple of years ago, I think, where a man, he said his locked his family, his wife, and I'm not sure how many kids in the car and set the car on fire. It was a horrific crime. And it turned out that there'd been some kind of, there was an upcoming divorce, and he knew he was probably going to lose custody of his children. So there was kind of a mitigating, I mean, it's no excuse, obviously, but there was that as the context for what he did. But when a few people suggested that, even a particular police officer made some reference to that, and then he was immediately attacked and he had to walk it back, and all of that. You're not allowed to have any empathy at all for a man who commits a horrific crime like that. But on the other side, like when women do the exact same thing, there's this rush to find all the circumstances. She had to have been mentally ill. Why didn't anybody notice? Why didn't anybody help her? We need to put mechanisms in place so that we can recognize
Are
and
you
help these women
are
when
you
they,
a country fan?
need
Are you a country
a
music?
country fan.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
know, I dug my key into, Carrie Underwood?
I don't know that one actually.
There's a hit
No.
song about her like breaking her boyfriend's car and like digging
Mm,
like she keyed his car and
uh-huh.
and like it's mainstream. Nobody even said anything. But if a guy did that to a girl, it's like everyone would be up
Right.
in arms. They'd be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
possessed, crazy, controlling." Even if she did
Mhm.
cheat, like they wouldn't care because it was all about she can do whatever she wants because he cheated. But it's like,
Because he cheated, right? Yeah. No, there's always the double standards. If a woman cheats, like I've read articles, if a woman cheats, it's because she's not, her needs aren't being met, so she's the victim.
yeah,
And that's a liberating thing. And suddenly, a woman's sexual needs or emotional needs, she has a right to have those met. Whereas in the case of a man, of course, if a man has unmet sexual needs, well, that's just too bloody bad. That makes him a loser, and we certainly don't have any kind of empathy for a loser male. I mean, I'm always so struck by that with all the discussion about incels and incel
oh,
violence.
people think it's
You
like I
know,
got 1.5 million subscribers in a year, and everyone's convinced they're all incels. And it's so crazy. It's like you think 1.5 million people are just incels, like because we talk about men's issues.
mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah,
it's crazy. Oh, they're just
yeah.
incels who can't talk to women. It's a cope, really. It's a
Well,
cope.
and that's so interesting. I like that. Why is that the go-to slur? Like, why, even if it were the case that you had 1.5 million incels who were signing up, which, well, so, like, you know, so why, like, what's wrong with that? Why is it a slur that there is a significant number of young men who, rightly or wrongly, figure they're never going to have a girlfriend, and that they're going to be celibate all their lives, and they don't want to be, and they're angry about that and frustrated with that situation? Why is that something to laugh about? I mean, I find again, yeah, like it's both a lack of empathy, and more than that, like it's hatred. And yeah, if like I've read so many articles about the alleged threat by incels, who are allegedly full of misogyny, and they're going to harm women. Um, and the feminist perspective seems to be, these terrible guys, they figure they should have a right to sex. Well, if it's a woman, and then they do seem to speak as if a woman has a right, not only a right to sex, she has a right to have an orgasm. I was reading this ridiculous article just recently about the orgasm gap. by these researchers at university, you know, essentially trying to pretend that this is some sort of injustice, that our society doesn't value women's sexual pleasure. So
Okay,
there's all that. But
what
then meantime, you've got,
if guys made an article about like how women are terrible at sucking dick or something?
I know,
It's like
isn't it
we'd
amazing?
be up in arms. They'd be like too much
Yeah,
the teeth gap or like something like that.
yeah, I
We would
know.
all be mad, but they could just
Yeah. Yeah. No, and the article was so insulting. Like it did have such a clear anti-male agenda. It was suggesting that, I mean, everything was wrong with men. Either they didn't know what to do to give women pleasure because they have this, you know, unrealistic sense of
all
what
right.
causes an orgasm.
These feminists
Um,
have sex with these men that don't care about them and then wonder why they're not it's like, well, that's what happens when you sleep with 10 men from the bar, Diane. I don't know what to tell you. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like, stop. Now you're like whining in an article. Like, get out of here.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it is remarkable, like how the whole focus of everything shifts when you're talking about women as compared to men. And, you know, but their attitude to incels is just, you know, we have to keep telling these men that they don't have a right to anything. They don't have a right to happiness. They don't have a right to have a sexual partner. And women don't owe them anything. If we keep telling them that, that's going to make everything okay. Like it's yeah, well, you get the very clear sense that feminists and women in general, I think, actually want to see men suffer. And as bad as things get for men, they'd be happy to see them get even worse.
Well, thank you for coming on. You're like a fountain of knowledge. Like, I can tell you've been studying this stuff forever.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed having a chance to speak with you about all these things.
Do you want to tell the people where they can find you if they want to like follow you on YouTube or whatever?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel called Studio B. And yeah, if you put Studio B Fiamengo into Google, it should come up. And I have there basically a history of feminist thought and feminist advocacy. And I also have a Substack newsletter, and I'd really love to have people take out a subscription, free subscription. I've got a really great, robust comment section, and so that is fiamengofile.substack.com.
Well, thank you for coming on. Um, guys, make sure you like the video on your way out and subscribe to the channel and go subscribe to her channel. This woman's a fountain of knowledge right here. Like the video on your way out, subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you next time.